Hello and welcome to the European Parliament in Brussels for this new edition of Talking Europe. Spain's banking sector has sunk deeper into crisis. This after Bankia, the country's third largest bank, requested a bailout. It's a vicious circle. The situation has pushed Spain's borrowing costs to almost 7% and threatens now to undermine the whole Eurozone. Does Europe have a plan for Spain and for the rest of the continent? I'll put this question to my guest who will soon join me in the European Parliament. And then is the second part of Talking Europe. I'll talk to Philippe de Fontaine-Vive, the Vice President of the European Investment Bank. He will tell me what his bank can do to revive growth across Europe. But let's start at the European Parliament here to talk about the poor state of Spanish banks, which has rocked Europe's stock markets this week, with the euro sinking to its lowest level in almost 2 years. The situation is particularly critical around the country's third largest bank, Bankia, which requires 19 billion euros in fresh capital to cover its losses. Where will the money come from? Let me introduce you to my two guests here on my set, starting to my left with you, Raúl Romeva y Rueda. You're a Spanish MEP from the group of Greens, originally from Barcelona.
From Catalonia, right.
From Catalonia. Also on the set, Charles Goerens, you're from Luxembourg, a country famous for its banks. Your banks are doing better, apparently, and you're from the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats. Thank you very much for being on our set. Now, before we talk about Bankia, which has been grabbing headlines in recent days across Europe, of course, tell me, Raúl, how critical is the situation of Spain? What is the risk, the imminent risk of a contagion across the Eurozone?
Well, the situation in Spain is very critical, but not only at the financial dimension, basically also and mostly at the social dimension. I mean, all the measures that have been taken so far to save the banks have not a direct impact into the social dimension. And this is creating a situation of frustration. And that's what I consider to be much more dangerous than the fact of the Bankia itself. So the Bankia debate is simply one part of the big picture. The picture is really, really bigger than this one.
Yeah, after the housing bubble, as it's called, exploded or imploded, unemployment rose to 25%.
50% if you take the youth unemployment, which is really, 50%. Really something that is dramatic. I mean, you cannot reactivate the economy in a country with such an employment level. It's something that needs to be tackled very, very, very dramatically.
Charles Goerens, what is your view from Luxembourg, a country which has a very good record when it comes to its public finances? How worried are you that the situation in Spain is going to plunge Europe into a fresh crisis?
Well, we are very concerned by the situation in Spain. What's good for Spain is good for Luxembourg, is good for all the members of the Eurozone and Europe as a whole. We are concerned because Spain has a very good record before the crisis in 2008. It was one of the few countries having less than 60% public debt in relation to the GDP. And after the crisis disappeared, we had a real problem because the economy in Spain was driven by the construction sector. And once the crisis appeared, as I said, we had a real problem and a decrease in economic activities. And nowadays we have to face a banking crisis and a state crisis, a sovereign debt crisis. Who could imagine a few years ago that one day or another, sooner or later, public assets, sovereign debt could one day become a toxic asset? Huh? We are.
So it is indeed a vicious circle, as you describe it. Absolutely. Now, before we talk about this in more detail, let's watch our first report there on the situation around Bankia. As I said, this is the third largest bank in Spain, and it requires 19 billion euros in fresh capital. This is far more than the resources available in the country's bailout fund.
Another torrid day on the Spanish markets and no end in sight to the uncertainty. Not helping the situation, bad news from the country's fourth largest lender, Bankia. Effectively nationalised last week with 2 injections of government money worth 23.5 billion euros, the bank's parent company announced losses of 3.3 billion for 2011, as opposed to predicted profits of 41 million. About half of that was down to losses at Bankia. Even worse, the bank's exposure to toxic loans secured on property whose value has collapsed is now estimated at €40 billion, 25% higher than previously thought. All bad news for the Spanish Prime Minister, who's insisted the country won't need a bailout to save its banks. The markets aren't convinced, though. Spain's borrowing costs are creeping closer to unsustainable levels.
The risk premium in Spain is rocketing because there's fear about the Spanish financial system. Because people and investors don't believe Spain will be capable of fulfilling its deficit reduction promises. They've seen Spain say they would have a deficit of 6%, then it was 8.5%, and then it ended up being 8.9%.
Compounding Spain's misery, new figures from its central bank predicting the economy will remain in recession until at least the end of June. There are more dark clouds on the horizon. Madrid needs to find a way to help its heavily indebted regions to raise funds. Joint bonds backed by the Treasury look likely, but could push Spain's borrowing costs even higher.
This is really the story of Spain. Its banks lent too much money that they will probably never see again. We saw here Bankia owns 40 billion euros in toxic loans. There's a big problem with the banks. What's next? There are two options. When you listen to your Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, says, we don't need a bailout, we can sort out the mess ourselves, we will recapitalize the bank. But a lot of European leaders, including Hollande, don't believe that this is realistic. They're calling for the EFSF to recapitalize the bank. So for Europe's structural funds to step in and recapitalize the bank. What is your position? Can Spain deal with the situation itself?
No. First, I think that Spain cannot. And the other thing is that the only solution I see feasible is double-sided. One, it has to be from Europe-wide perspective, which means that it needs to be assumed by Europe that is not only a Spanish problem. It is a Spanish dimension, but not only a Spanish dimension. And second, let's face the democratic control of the rescue, if you want to call it. The problem is that there is a responsibility of the banks, right? But we are now socializing the costs. And that's something that the population is not really ready to accept. Let's see what is happening in Greece. The problem now, this figure that you mentioned, the almost 20,000 million euros that are needed to rescue Bankia, is exactly the same amount that you are cutting from social expenditures. So the people is saying that on the social dimension they are losing capacity of reaction, and on the other side we are having money, even European money, to save the banks that are not paying their responsibility on the crisis themselves. So in that sense, I need to stress that differing from Rajoy, there is something that I consider crucial. That's not only the European dimension, but the democratic control of this rescue.
What do you say about Mr. Rajoy when he says, I can deal with the situation myself, I don't need a bailout from Europe? Is he being courageous or stubborn and irresponsible?
Well, he has to face the dilemma. On the one hand, he is aware of the fact that the bank must be rescued, because unless the rescue, he will have to face a real crisis, which will go far beyond the Spanish borders and will contaminate the whole Eurozone. That's the one part of the problem. The other part is if he accepts money from outside, from the EFSF, for instance, or from the MSE, which will enter into force the 1st of July this year.
Europe's rescue funds.
If the money is channeled through national administrations, in that case he will have an increase in his public deficit. And that means another series of austerity measures. Mm-hmm. And that's not affordable on the social level in Spain, as my colleague said.
And it would be felt as a humiliation for Spain. And you've really stressed the problem here, because so far the rescue funds can only be used to bail out the governments, the states. Now, what François Hollande and the President of the European Commission says that the EFSF should be used directly to recapitalize the banks.
Not passing through the government.
Is this feasible? It's not possible.
Well, it's not possible under current circumstances, but it can be changed. I mean, it can be done in a way that is feasible. I mean, it
and would that be the solution?
That would be part of the solution. But I insist, once again, it's true, there is a question of You say kind of humiliation, some say kind of egos. Fine, but I think the problem is not that only. I can understand this perception of some people saying, well, I don't want to be rescued because it's humiliating, but I want to turn it around. I mean, the problem there is that if we don't understand that the economical solution has to be Europeanized, nobody is going to be safe. Because when we...
And very concretely, what do you mean when you say it has to be Europeanized?
Very simple. I mean, we have to admit that we all have to lose sovereignty at the state level to give it to the European institutions. We need an European fiscal system. We need an European way of banking. Let's say the bank system in the different member states, banking union. If we afford this, we will save. Maybe to save the current situation, we will need other measures, but we will impede future crises, which are, to me, as important as to save the ones.
Do you believe there is a consensus at the European level for a fiscal union, a banking union? Is it, for instance, the case in your country, Luxembourg?
Yes, in my country there's no problem. Even in the European Parliament there is a strong majority supporting this idea. That's not it's among the member states that it's very difficult to find a solution. And we must overcome this situation. You have a cleavage not between the socialists and conservatives. We have a clear cleavage between Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, and hardliners on the one hand, and other people, politicians in Europe, which aim at having two pillars for the future policy, one based on stability, another one on growth. You need the two. It's not one or another. It's the two pillars at the same time. There are several additional measures you can imagine in order to overcome the situation. Let's take, for instance, 50 billion euro still unemployed, unallocated in the European Commission.
You're talking about a structural funds.
About structural funds, because there is a lack of capacity of.
And what would you like to do with this money?
I would like to allocate this money to the European Investment Bank.
Invest, exactly. That's the question. Invest. That's what it has to be done.
The EIB, and with this money, the European Investment Bank could be put in a position to lend 20 times more money than the original amount of 50 billion. That's one possibility. Another possibility is to, well, we cannot give lessons from outside to the European Central Bank of Frankfurt, but if you read the article or the interview given by a Belgian professor of the London School of Economics, Mr. Paul de Grove, he said yesterday that the European Central Bank should buy all the sovereign debts, which must pay, for which you must pay more than 3% of interest rates. And there is, in my view, a very useful argument to support this idea. All the countries which have more than 60% of sovereign debt in relation to GDP are in a certain sense responsible for this crisis. And if you have responsible, you have to face your responsibility. Now, and that means Eurobonds, you have to mutualize the European debt.
Precisely, on Eurobonds.
Originated beyond the 60%.
Eurobonds, the idea of jointly guaranteed European bonds, this is a project which is completely unpalatable to the Chancellor of Germany. She says, I don't want it. What is your position? Are you confident it could restore
absolutely.
some kind of
confidence? I think it's part of the solution. It cannot be the solution at the short term. We all know this. I mean, if we get them, we are not going to have them, in 2 months. I mean, it needs a change of the treaty, so it's something that is not going to be easy to do. But it's part of the solution for the future crisis, and that's important. So I fully support the Eurobonds. In that sense, what I don't understand is why Mariano Rajoy is opposing to this. I mean, he said that he's not opposing. He's saying that simply that is not the time to do it. But if we don't start thinking about this right now, I mean, we are going to be late. So in that sense, I fully support the Eurobonds. On the meantime, we have the redemption fund. That's something that we can be used in order to mutualize the debt. Obviously, Merkel is opposing to this because that means sharing the responsibility, but on the other side, and that's what is important, it means also the possibility of creating investments that will allow countries
what Angela Merkel
to
says
recover.
is that she doesn't want to share the toxic debts of her neighbors,
Exactly.
and she doesn't want to see her borrowing costs rise.
Well,
You
but
can understand her point of view to a certain extent.
It's understandable, but it's a risk decision, because what we has to be put on the table as well is that unless there is an European solution, it's not going to be a solution at all, because you might have the feeling that you can simply put a wall on the south or whatever. That's impossible. On the current situation, that's completely impossible. One. And two, let's remember that the growth of the Germany in the last years has begun, or it was important basically because other member states, among them Spain, bought a lot of products produced by Germany. If there is no that capacity anymore, Germany will have a problem sooner or later. So in that sense, something that is important.
But let's not forget that Germany too is responsible for the huge sovereign debt. Because at the time when Spain was far below 60%, Germany increased
exactly.
its the budget deficit.
As did France.
And nowadays,
now they forget about it.
And nowadays it's even higher than the Spanish general sovereign debt in relation to GDP.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid, as we're running out of time, but thank you very much for taking part in this edition of Talking Europe. Please stay on France 24. We'll return after the news break and we'll bring you a close-up interview with Philippe de Fontaine-Vive. He's the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, and he will tell us what his bank can do to revive growth across Europe.